conversation with us on PFAS and some of the environmental concerns we have here in Newington. So I'd really like to thank them. I know he's got a lot of experts. I see some of them in the crowd from last time, but you did a great job last time for us, and we're really looking forward to tonight's presentation on PFAS and how it affects us. So, welcome.
Thank you so much. So thank you, everyone. Really quick, is this okay, or do you want me to turn off the front lights? Oh. Okay, hold on. So let's do that. Let's turn the lights back there. There we go. That's perfect. Okay. So again, my name is Dr. Jonathan Patelli. I am a toxicologist with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and our environmental health program. I'm essentially here to figure out how much chemicals are in various things and tell you if we should be panicking or not. I'm joined here tonight by Dr. Paula Mauser again, who's going to talk about some civil environmental engineering aspects, sort of fate and transport of chemicals in the environment. We're also joined by Dr. Megan Romano, an epidemiologist from Dartmouth College, who's going to talk about other sources of exposure and also maybe get some feedback and input about clinician guidance information. And we're also fortunately joined by Dr. Wendy Janacek from UNH Extension Group to just basically be here and hear what some concerns are related to backyard produce, growing, gardening, and other things that maybe we could be thinking about in the future. So for those of you that are joining remotely, we do have technical support from Rob Thistle. He's from my program as well. He is online to help out. His number is listed there. We're using Microsoft Teams. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, we have a chat function. You can throw questions into the chat and we'll answer those after we get done with the presentation. There's also a raise hand function, and Rob can unmute you if you'd prefer to ask your question over the loudspeakers for us. This meeting is being recorded, so we are going to be posting this online. I have a video from last week that I want to dub over some of the weak audio that we had and get that posted as well. So this will be recorded and available for everyone. So the focus of tonight's meeting is a shift from last week. So last week we really focused on stuff that was in the Great Bay, fish, shellfish, water, sediments, or the aquatic side of things. Tonight, we're going to be going more into backyards and homes. And a lot of this is trying to address some uncertainty and some questions that folks might be having around backyard sampling that was done, or for folks that haven't had any sampling done, just trying to understand what might be sources of PFAS in their backyards and in their homes that they could be thinking about if they wanted to reduce their exposures. So we're going to aim for 45 minutes, a maybe better aim than we did last time when we gave the presentation for talking, and then we'll hand it over for Q&A. So again, we may not have answers to all your questions tonight. And if that's the case, we can either try to find the right person and connect you to those people for those questions, or in some cases, it's going to help us understand what do we need to be working to in our respective programs, what research questions are still out there by the community, and what resources should we be looking for to address those. Now we have to start through this again. We did this last week, but just in case anyone's joining us for the first time, we're going to do PFAS 101. So what are PFAS? PFAS is an acronym that each of the presenters tonight are going to say over and over again. It represents a large family of chemicals. So when we say PFAS, that is the family. But every now and then we'll talk about specific ones. So up here, we just have examples of 4 specific PFAS in that family. These are also the ones that we currently regulate for in drinking water in New Hampshire. But this is a really large family. There's over 10,000 compounds. Basically, however creative you can get with the squiggly lines and letters up there, you probably have a PFAS. They're highly durable chemicals, so they're very resistant to degradation. Since they don't really break down, they can just move around when they get into the environment. And that's sort of where we have this issue of finding them in a lot of places that we test for. They are persistent. Some of them can be very bioaccumulative, which really feeds into how toxic some of these can be. And that concern for toxicity is why we start regulating drinking water. There's been a lot of research efforts put into understanding the risk of these. Now, again, these are just examples of PFAS compounds. Sometimes we might say Okay, can everyone hear me online?
I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Megan. So we lost you all for a minute. So I'm going to go back and do a quick, just brief rehash because I think you only missed one slide. So we just gave you the definition of PFAS, what they are, what it means. No one get hung up on acronyms tonight. We'll walk through anything we need to. We talked a lot about their sources, that there's a lot of those, and that can make things complicated on identifying where the PFAS came from when we're testing for it. So this is a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but again, these are some of the ways that we might find PFAS coming into the environment. And then we got here, and we were talking about what do we do when we look at samples. So when we look at a soil sample, a fish sample, maybe egg samples, we want to compare it to something. So we were saying that when you have a non-detect, that means that the concentrations of the chemical are so low that our current methods for measuring the chemical can't find it. There may be other PFAS that we simply don't have the ability to measure for present in the environment. And that's the case with a lot of other chemicals too, outside of PFAS, is we only have a limited array of tools to measure certain chemicals in our environment. Now we use screening levels to determine, do we want to keep going on an investigation with this? It doesn't necessarily mean that someone is at risk, but it means they are getting close to there, and depending on the situation, we may have an issue. And that's what we want to look at more when something exceeds a screening level. So in the case of Ps with their investigation, the screening levels are usually applied in a way to ask, do we want to keep sampling here, and do we need to evaluate this more for either cleanup, remediation, or figuring out what don't we understand in this situation just yet. Now, beyond that, we actually have regulations. And so a really clear example I think most folks are familiar with is like a drinking water regulation, like a maximum contaminant level. So that's an enforceable drinking water standard that public water systems have to meet. In New Hampshire, we have an analogy to that for groundwater called our ambient groundwater quality standard. And that's basically our groundwater number that if there's an exceedance, we recommend private well users look at treatment. It also helps us direct site investigations. Tonight, since we're going to be talking about backyard produce, backyard poultry, backyard other items, this gets to be a sort of tricky realm because we don't have a lot of hard regulations for backyard producers or backyard growers. So we do have some state regulations for people that are either preparing foods or selling foods, backyard game, or like small farmers, but that's if they are basically producing a large enough amount and selling enough that they're considered more of a small business. When you have someone with backyard chickens, the state doesn't come in and regulate those. We don't regulate what is in their meat. We don't regulate what is in the eggs. A lot of times there are screening and guidance relative to infectious conditions or infectious disease, but contaminants is still sort of the Wild West when it comes to backyard produce items. Because the idea is if you're growing those things there, right, it's on you to figure out what's maybe going on with the soil. Now, in a case where something like PFAS or maybe contaminants may be introduced, this does get complicated because, right, it's not something that you intentionally put there yourself. So that's just to be very clear because sometimes it gets swapped around, I guess. I'm trying to think of the best word for this, where folks will try to use a screening level like a regulatory standard, and they're not the same. And it really changes what the regulatory authorities can do and what we can act on. And it also really kind of affects like who do we go after if we even had a regulatory standard. Now, this is a table of numbers. Last week, we talked about some examples in surface water or in sediment or in shellfish or fish of how we might come up with screening levels and what those numbers might be. And the thing for PFAS is, depending on some of their properties, their screening levels can differ. So again, these are just examples and they're not definitive screening levels for any one given site. But in this first column here, I wanted to give an example of what the range might be for something like if we were looking at backyard chicken eggs, because, right, the elephant in the room for some folks here is the Air Force did some sampling of chicken eggs in backyards and likely found PFAS in them. One of the challenges to that is usually our state agency doesn't look at chicken eggs for anything in the first place, so this is sort of novel for us. But we also realize, looking around, because PFAS have a unique ability to move around in the environment, in living things, in water, soil, back and forth, it's really sort of pushing the envelope and what we look at as far as trying to evaluate risk. So if we just go through some of these numbers, right? So for like PFOS, that's one of the ones that we regulate here in the state, and also with this being an area that has a FFF contamination nearby, PFOS and PFHXS are the likely suspects for what you will detect, right? Whether it's in certain water samples, probably in soil. So the range there is just showing that depending on who we're talking about, if we're talking about small children eating eggs routinely, if we're talking about adults, depending on who we're looking at would determine how we would apply that screening level. Maine has recently put out draft numbers. They do not actually have an enforceable number yet. They do not have a definitive screening level. They did have something that was temporary, but it is in the same ballpark as this because they had several farms that were heavily contaminated that had a lot of free-range chickens on them. They went out and tested the eggs and they found that the eggs had pretty high concentrations. One of the challenges though to that, and this is where this gets a little tricky, is the screening level tells us, okay, if we're at or above that, let's investigate and let's think about this a little bit more and see what else is going on. So in talking with Maine and talking with other states that have done some sampling, some university groups, looking at the literature, it seems like actually chickens are pretty good at taking PFAS, specifically PFOS, from their environment, and they can put it in their eggs pretty well. But it doesn't really matter unless with respect to their drinking water. It's actually maybe more of an issue of their feed, the soil, and the sort of food web that they're foraging in. So what this means for the screening level, though, is it's an issue of, is this actually unique to an area like peas, where there's a known contaminated site? Or, as Paul is going to mention later, if you have soil that has PFAS in it, could you have eggs like this pretty much anywhere you look? Now, the FDA has done some sampling of grocery store eggs, so the things that are in the mass-produced chicken farms out west. I'm from Nebraska originally. I totally know what those farms are and smell like. What they've done in that kind of testing, right, when you have these very controlled scenarios, you don't really see PFOS in the eggs. But also, when we look at some studies of backyard growers, we also see that when the animals come inside and they don't have access to their natural ecosystem or the soil, the egg concentrations go down fast. So this creates a real challenge for us trying to understand what's going on with the accumulation here. What does this mean? So I realize there's probably a lot of questions for this. I will get to those. I do want to just move this along so that way we have a chance for Paula and for Megan to talk, but I'm totally happy to spend like 2 hours talking about chickens. Now with vegetables, right, this is a screening level that I could have split this up for screening levels for tomatoes, lettuce, onions, radishes, garlic. We could have had a whole grocery list and a salad up there of different screening levels for each of these. So I just sort of took the lowest worst case scenario and put it up there as a starting point, because if I put too many numbers on the slide, someone's going to chastise me for making it unreadable. But again, these are lower levels, but also in plants, a lot of the ones that we regulate up there in those white rows, we don't really see those concentrations unless we're in extremely, extremely contaminated sites. Plants seem to pick up PFAS differently than animals do. They accumulate them differently. So what is a forever chemical in a human isn't necessarily a forever chemical in certain plants. And that's just important for us to think about when we look at numbers that are at or around the screening levels. We want to try to understand it some more. Yep.
Soil or the water or both?
Oh, I'm actually going to give an example of that in the next few slides. So thanks for the setup. Now, in this last column, these are the current soil screening levels for these compounds in New Hampshire. We are actually in the process of setting a statewide soil standard. They're currently drafting it. There will be a really fun public comment period coming up. But that is one of the things that we do actually have a regulatory standard for, is, or at least will be soon, is for soils. But again, when we look at soils in this context, right, this is for our screening number to figure out what else do we need to know about this, who's at risk, how is this land being used, so on and so forth. So, because I was set up so nicely, one of the things that the state did over the last year and a half or so is we've done 2 little studies to try to understand what's going on in New Hampshire soils, because there are some people that are studying plant uptake of PFAS around the world in different conditions. Unfortunately, Australia is not very comparable to New Hampshire, so we wanted to get some local data. And we started this by doing a big elaborate greenhouse study using biosolids, because there's been concern about biosolids because of what's going on in Maine. We also use some very contaminated AFFF containing water that is probably 100 to 1,000 times higher than what I've seen in most of the test results around Newington. And then we wanted to see what plant uptake looked like. And we really needed this worst case scenario of the most contaminated biosolids with the most contaminated soils, with the most contaminated water, to see plants that were taking up enough PFAS that it crossed any of our screening levels. Just plants don't seem to pick these up the same way. And our soil seems to have some differences where it lets the PFAS either stick into the soil and not go to the plant. We're still working through some of that data, but one of the examples I'm going to give that's more of a real world case was while we were doing this, we learned that the town of Amherst has an AFFF plume going underneath their town from their own fire department. So in that case, it's not the DoD or Department of Defense. The town itself is the responsible party because it was their fire department. And in the course of testing wells and seeing where the plume went, we learned that actually the irrigation well for their community garden was a part of that plume. So we immediately thought, okay, this is a really unique opportunity for us to go out to a community garden. We have a really cooperative, responsible party that was totally in favor of us getting samples in the name of science and to understand what's going on more. So huge shout out to them. And we wanted to see what did uptake actually look like in some of the vegetables that we could get from their garden. We got out there in about September, so it was like spotty choice on what we could get. Just to preface all this before we get into the results, the town has taken super proactive steps to deal with any of the things that we identified in this, even though we had no regulatory authority to like make them do anything. They just went, as soon as we show them data, they're like, okay, we're going to make these choices and make some of these changes, which was great. So these are pie charts just showing the different composition of the different kinds of PFAS that were there, because we wanted to look in the soil that the plants were grown in. We wanted to look at the water at the far end. So the total amount of PFAS that we can measure. So getting back to your question before, right? There was a list of about, I believe it's about 35 analytes that we looked at. And it was about 130 parts per trillion of total PFAS that we could measure there. And it was mostly PFOS and PFH excess and the other ones that we see with firefighting foam. And then we looked at the soil, and actually that soil breakdown is pretty similar to what we see when the state has sampled PFAS across all of it. So we looked across New Hampshire, we did spatial sampling to see where there are PFAS, and everywhere we sampled soil, there is detectable levels of PFAS in it. Yeah.
Into the air. So there was an airborne.
So that was in Merrimack. The air emission was in Merrimack. In Amherst, it was their own fire department. Mm-hmm.
Have you seen any evidence that that airborne source has contaminated the soil more globally rather than just points of contamination?
So I don't want to steal too much of Paula's thunder later, but with aerial deposition, we have seen a signature specifically around like Merrimack and in some of those immediate town areas around these specific facilities that had those air emissions. We do see a distinct signature. But when we look across the entire state, right, when we go up into the White Mountains, we don't have any factories up there that are emitting PFAS or doing textile coating or any of these other practices, and we're still detecting PFAS in the soil. That's telling us this is probably a long-range global transport issue. It's something that is being carried long range through the air currents from clear across the country. Other parts of the world, we're still trying to understand how far, but it's probably all of our soils have this contamination, probably from long range transport like that, not just a specific local source. In New Hampshire, we do have a couple of very specific industries that have caused very relatively large geographic depositions for their size. But as far as the entire state goes, it's hard to turn around and say it was those specific industries when it's clear north side of the state and there isn't an explanation with the air currents of why that would be contributing.
Understanding the airborne source of contamination of PFAS as you look at the soil and the water and garden problems.
So let me finish this part and then we'll come back to that. I like where you're going with this. So with the Amherst garden, right, when we looked at their soil, these soil concentrations in the garden were pretty representative of actually what we see in any soils from across the state. So whether or not it was in an AFFF garden or in other parts, what was actually really bizarre at first, until I talked to some of our people in our biosolids and composting program, was the all organic, all natural compost that they had been buying for was that. And it had more PFAS than the soil did. The town actually since then has no longer purchased that compost. They actually found there's someone, I think down in Milford, there's a provider that has been testing their stuff for PFAS in the last 6 to 5 years and has had non-detects across the board. So switched over to that one. But this is one of those points where with PFAS, and Paul's going to sort of get into this with some of the waste cycle of this, we're finding unsuspected sources that, right, to anyone just thinking, oh my gosh, we had an AFFF contamination in the water, that must be the biggest source of PFAS for this garden. When we actually went and looked at their all natural, all good green compost, this stuff had more PFAS in it than the soils that had been irrigated for years with this well. So when we actually looked at some of the plants, I know the bars look a little big, but the y-axis only goes up to 1 part per billion. Right, we saw a couple different PFAS and realized it's a color scheme. It looks like blown up children's cereal up there, and I apologize for that. But even though we did have detections of some PFAS in there, they weren't exceeding our screening levels. So it's something of, we do still see some PFAS in there because it was grown in that soil. But again, these soils are looking pretty close to what we're seeing sort of around the state. And this is even when we're talking about with irrigation with AFFF containing water. But again, different plants will take up PFAS differently, just like different animals will. So we still want to get more data. We still want to evaluate it. And that's the thing that the screening levels are there for, is to help us trigger, what don't we understand about this? What else could we be looking at it for? But, right, the example of this is to show if we had just gone out and sampled the plants and the vegetables, because we knew that there was an AFFF site, we never would have identified that they had this compost that was putting in all these other PFAS into this garden. And that's one of the things with these investigations that can be frustrating, is we start looking at other sources. They still put on treatment for the water that was there, but when they realized how much PFAS was in that compost, they had not thought that that was going to be a source. We didn't think it was going to be a source because it's supposed to be organic and natural and all the other nice buzzwords that we like seeing at places like Whole Foods. So, right, it's just an example of that. Now, just to revisit what standards are again, and because I realize we do have an audience here that has like concerns around drinking water issues, right? There are going to be upcoming changes, possibly if EPA finalizes their proposed standard in drinking water. So in the blue columns is what the US EPA has proposed. It is currently in their Office of Management and Budget. So if anyone wants to take bets right now, we can start a pool at the end of tonight. Right now, New Hampshire has its own MCLs that we established. We proposed them in 2019. They got codified into law in 2020. That's what we enforce at public water systems. That's also what's enforced for bottled water. We're one of the few states that actually does that because the FDA currently does not use a standard for PFAS. But it's also the groundwater number that we use. And that's what we compare private well results to. If any of you have gotten private well results and you want someone to look over them or talk with you about them and go through those, because maybe whoever provided those hasn't done that, a lot of private labs will just give you a list of numbers. Give us a call and we're happy to talk through it, tell you what we know, what we don't know, what the uncertainties are, what it could mean. So there are going to be some other changes likely coming down the road for PFAS. It means that this is an evolving area of science. For everyone that is sort of questioning, what does that mean when I say evolving area of science? Think about how things have been with COVID, where every couple of months or so, especially in like the early part of the pandemic, we were changing what we were doing. It's going to be changing, and we expect it to change more, especially this upcoming year, if EPA can push through some of the changes that they've been proposing. So with that, I'm going to end my piece of this. I'm just going to plug for the state website where we have a sampling map of all the groundwater results we've been doing. There's also information for a lot of the other investigations we have done in other media and other issues. And you can look at that. We have contact information if you want to get more specifics from folks. But now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Mauser to talk about PFAS sources around residential areas. Okay.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm Paula Mauser. It's great to see some familiar faces. And for those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm a professor at the University of New Hampshire in civil and environmental engineering. And last week, we were talking about sources of PFAS to our aquatic systems and water systems. And so shifted a few of these slides to think more about some of the main sources of PFAS in and around our homes, especially for those of us, and I'm included, that has a garden and tries to grow a lot of my own food. So we're looking here, I mean, half of this particular schematic is showing agricultural areas, more large-scale agricultural areas and residential areas, and I'm seeing that it's not coming up very well. But there's a couple of main places where PFAS can come in and around our homes. The main place that we're seeing it, especially in states like New Hampshire, is in the very shallow soils. And this is because we have some of these large point sources, industrial activities that went on for many decades. And they emitted into the atmosphere PFAS that then were part of the air, and they combined with water, and they moved out a certain radius from that industry and then deposited in our soils and water bodies. And so one of the things that we are doing right now with my group, and I'll show some of this data, is we're looking at PFAS and precipitation to try to understand how much of this is still happening. Now, it's probably changed quite a lot from what it was many years ago, because there are controls for these compounds now at a lot of these industries. But as a result, we've had a lot of deposition in our soils. We also can have PFAS that's deposited if we are using irrigation water that's coming from contaminated groundwater. And that contaminated groundwater can be from an AFFF site like at Pease or a local fire department. But as John mentioned, it's possible that we have PFAS that are part of our own waste system, our septic systems. That septic is treated in our septic boxes, and then it's discharged into our drainage areas. And sometimes those drainage areas are moving out and eventually come in contact with some of that groundwater. And so depending on where we're pulling that from, we could potentially be pulling some PFAS that's coming from our own septic system. It hasn't broken down. And then another really important source that we're learning a lot more about are the amendments that are being used in our gardens. Things like compost and fertilizers can contain PFAS, and we might not even know it. John gave an example of some of the compost product that this local community was using. And I just wanted to mention that I had a chance to do some literature review last fall on agricultural sources of PFAS. And there was a recent study up in Maine that was particularly fascinating. There's an annual organic farm event that happens up there. And And at this particular event, they shifted over to using some of the compostable plates and cups in an effort to reduce some of their solid waste. And I don't know if you've ever seen some of those materials, but oftentimes they have a brown color to them. They attract and repel water and food in specific ways. They almost kind of look shiny. They actually, in this study, they actually found when they looked at the compost that was generated from some of these compostable materials, that those materials actually had considerable PFAS in them. Okay, so we have this issue where we're trying to do the right thing and use compostable materials, but those products actually contain unknowingly some of the chemicals that we're trying to avoid. And so these are some of the questions that we're looking at, and some of the things that we might not know that's happening behind the scenes in the products that we're using. As John mentioned, there's been a lot of great work in trying to understand the background concentrations of PFAS. And we have to do that so that we understand how to set the standards for cleanup for some of these sites. And so all 3 states, New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, have gone out and they've collected many samples in a randomized pattern, generally from areas that are away from point sources. Oftentimes they're in forested areas, and they've looked at the surface and in some cases gone down in depth to try to characterize these background samples of PFAS. So if you're interested in some of these results, they're available. The USGS performed the study in conjunction with DES here in New Hampshire, and they have released all of the data from this work. And I believe a report is still pending on that. Is that right?
On April 9th,
Fabulous.
they're part of the next lab meeting to present the New Hampshire study.
Great, thank you. So the comment from the audience is that there's going to be a presentation here in April. Is that right? On that data and the synthesis of that data. That's great. But there was a study in Maine that was published recently. And this study is pretty interesting because they also compared urban versus non-urban samples. And I thought that was pretty interesting to see. And then, of course, Vermont characterized their shallow soils as well. So there's a lot of information out there about how PFAS changes across the state. And in general, what these reports have seen is that concentrations generally decrease with depth, and this is related to the background levels being short and long range transport at the surface. Areas closer to industrial production seem to have higher concentration. So that's what we see here in our state, but we also see this in the literature as well. There have been some really interesting studies that look at radius away from an industrial point source and some of these concentrations. And then I did mention that most of these were collected from forested areas. So these studies generally avoided agricultural areas and areas close to point sources, and so those we would expect to see higher from some of the historic. So I did want to mention a little bit about some of the reading and what I've learned about plant uptake. And I think this is particularly important when we think about what we grow and what might be in the soils and the compost amendments that we use. Plants really variably accumulate PFAS. And there's quite a lot of ongoing research in this realm. And what we've learned is that oftentimes plants accumulate the longer chain compounds in the root systems. And then as they are transpiring and bringing that water up through the plant, the compounds that come up into the plant are generally going to be shorter and move easier with that water than the ones that remain down in the roots. And so we generally see that the things that are moving up into the fruit and into the leaves are generally going to be some of those shorter chain compounds, and then the longer chain are going to be down below the soil. And so this is particularly important because if you're somebody who eats a lot of root materials, like if you love carrots like I do, then that might be accumulating different kinds of compounds than if you're eating tomatoes or things that are above the ground that contain a lot of water, okay? So as I mentioned, there's a lot of ongoing research going on here. There's work characterizing how much they're accumulating in different types of vegetation, different types of fruits. But there's also an effort to think about how we can use some of these types of vegetation to clean up some of these sites, hyperaccumulating these compounds from shallow soils. And then I also wanted to just touch a little bit on another really important background source, and that's the precipitation or wet deposition that we're seeing in our area. And again, if we have these air emissions and they're moving up into the atmosphere and generating precipitation that's coming down in and around our homes, it's possible that PFAS is coming through that potential source. And we've been working on characterizing what PFAS looks like in our precipitation. We've set up samplers around Great Bay. 2 of them are in agricultural and rural areas, the Burley, Demerit, and Thompson Farm, which are owned by UNH. Up in Dover, we have a site in more of an urban area. And then right at the Great Bay at Adams Point, we have a sampler. And we're looking at rural to urban and freshwater to estuarine gradients. And we've been collecting samples for about the past year. We have collected 47 samples, and we're putting out samplers right now for collection of snow, but there hasn't been a lot of snow this year to collect. Hopefully we'll get a few samples there. And what we find is that just like in the background soils, we see PFAS in all of these samples that we collect, at least one. We have a very high detection rate of a lot of the very short chain compounds. And so in this table, we have lighter chain compounds are shown in the lighter colors, and then the longer chain compounds are shown in the darker colors. And you can see that as we get into the darker colors, we have less and less detection. And so the compounds that are moving in the deposition and in that precipitation and coming down are generally some of the smaller, lighter compounds. And we compared these values that we're detecting. Many of them are near detection limits or estimated around that range. And we compared them to other regions and found that they were fairly consistent with what we see in areas of the Great Lakes and considerably lower than areas of urban China where there might be a lot more industrial activities producing these compounds and depositing in the atmosphere. And so we still have a lot to learn, but there are several different sources to some of our background areas. They include atmospheric deposition, potentially amendments that we're using, and possibly irrigation waters and others. So I will leave it at that. Sound good? All right, thank you.
Okay. And the next speaker is Dr. Megan Romano from Dartmouth College. And Megan, I'm going to advance the slides for you, so you just tell me when to hit next.
I was hoping so, John, because that would be a neat trick for me to learn from here. Thank you so much, everyone. As John mentioned, I'm an associate professor of epidemiology at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth. My research has been really focused on PFAS these last several years. But I am a public health professional by training, and so I was really delighted to hear about these meetings that you were doing, and so glad to be here with you this evening. Next slide. So this is a topic that's often on folks' minds with PFAS, is just thinking about what are the things that we can do to reduce our PFAS exposures. And so the tips I'm going to talk about tonight are things that work broadly for a range of environmental chemicals, but are helpful for PFAS in particular as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about things you can do in your home thinking about your diet, as well as thinking about the types of things that you put on your body, because as we know, these are the majority of the PFAS are going to stick around in our bodies for a long time once we're exposed. So doing what we can to limit exposure and reduce our exposures is really an important part of the puzzle. So in our homes, you are probably acutely aware that it is very important to know what's going on with your water. And so if you do have a private well, you're going to want to test your private well for PFAS so that you have the opportunity to install a remediation system in the event that you find your PFAS concentrations are high in your home water. Additionally, PFAS kind of sneak into our homes in dust. And so some of the things that we think about doing are using HEPA air filters to improve our indoor air quality, avoiding stain-resistant carpets and furniture. We can do things like wet dust or mop, and using a vacuum with a HEPA filter as well to help trap some of that dust that may be tracking PFAS into our homes, and choosing safer cleaning products. In our diet, we think about things like eating more home-cooked, whole foods-based meals and less ultra-processed food. In general, we want to eat a well-balanced and varied diet, and that helps to keep us from having any sort of one thing that's like becomes a main component of our diet that may be contaminated. We also want to think carefully about fish and seafood consumption, as well as consumption of game meat, and choosing kind of safer types of containers that we're storing our food in when possible. When we think about our bodies, we want to reduce the number of products that we use daily, as well as choosing products with safer ingredients. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so coming back again to this idea of dust, when we think about what dust is, it is composed of very small particles. Environmental contamination, these chemicals that we're interested in avoiding may kind of stick to the dust, they sorb to it and become tightly connected to the dust, and this is a way that they come into our homes. So preventing or removing dust from the home by avoiding tracking soil into the house, removing shoes when we're inside, and again, using that sort of wet dusting techniques rather than dry dusting, where we just sort of put the dust back into the air, or using a vacuum cleaner with a HEPA filter can be incredibly helpful. Next slide. Okay, so I've said HEPA filter a couple of times already, and I should explain what it is. So a HEPA filter is a high efficiency particulate air filter. It is going to filter out very small particles, things like pollen, mold spores, pet dander, particulate matter from smoke, dust or dust mites, and typically does also capture airborne bacteria or viruses that may be in the air in our homes. And using a HEPA filter can help to remove dust and particles from the indoor air. So once again, kind of removing some of that contamination from the home by removing the dust. So we can use HEPA filters to improve air quality.
Megan, hold on
Of course.
1 second, Megan. The audio play on this slide is playing over you.
Sorry, you're getting my voiceover as well.
Let's see if the next one. Okay, we're just going to advance to the next slide. And Megan, if you just want to rehash HEPA filters, there's a little less dissonance now.
Perfectly fine. I'm so sorry about that. Yes, so the HEPA filters are going to take very small particles out of the air, things like dust, pollen, mold spores, also viruses and bacteria. And this can be incredibly useful for getting rid of that dust, reducing the chemical contamination. In addition to purchasing an air filter for your home with a that includes a HEPA filter, you can build a do-it-yourself device called a Corsi Rosenthal box. They're very easy to build. What you do is use furnace filters, the M13 variety, 4 of them, and a box fan, as well as some cardboard and duct tape. And these have been demonstrated to be quite efficient, in some cases even more efficient than the expensive ones that you can purchase from the store. And so this is a good way to reduce dust and particles in your home. It can also be helpful if you have folks in your family that with allergies or other issues along those lines. This can help to kind of keep the indoor air quality at kind of a premium within your home. All right, so then with that, we will move on to thinking about what are our safer food choices. So when we think about limiting PFAS in our diet, it's very hard to avoid it full stop. I think we've probably all struggled with this. And so we really start to think about these ideas of how do we make safer food choices? What are some of the choices that we can make that are likely to reduce our exposures? So very importantly, we want to avoid eating canned, packaged, or ultra-processed food. Microwave popcorn is actually a kind of major player in dietary exposures to PFAS, so it's helpful to avoid consuming microwave popcorn. When it's feasible to purchase organic produce, that can be very helpful. Environmental Working Group publishes a Clean 15 and a Dirty Dozen list every year that can be helpful to suggest which types of produce specifically you might want to target if you are only able to purchase certain types of organic produce. In addition to that, we really just want to kind of underscore this importance of eating a varied diet. You don't want any single food item to take up too large a proportion of your overall diet. And this is both for nutritional needs as well as for avoiding potential contaminants in different types of food. My colleague, I know Kate Crawford, was with you last week and spoke a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing looking at links between fish and seafood consumption and PFAS exposures. And so fish and seafood are another area where you want to be conscious of the amounts that you're eating, the amount you're including in your diet, bearing in mind that they're also, great sources of lean protein and omega fatty acids. So it can be, this kind of comes back again to that eating a varied diet advice where you're not letting fish and seafood become too large of a portion of your diet overall. When possible, you want to use glass or stainless steel food and beverage containers, avoiding nonstick pans, using things like stainless steel and cast iron instead. There's increasingly, we're understanding more and more about the presence of PFAS in game meat. And so this is an area to kind of watch and understand as it evolves. But we do see that venison sometimes contain quite high levels of PFAS. And so this is something to be aware of if you are hunting or are regularly consuming game meat. Next slide, please, John. Thank you. So when we think about choosing sort of safer consumer products, we can think about PFAS-free products for our home, choosing carpets and other textiles for our home that don't have those stain or water-resistant treatments is going to reduce the PFAS exposures within the home. PFAS Central maintains a great database that tells us about PFAS-free consumer products and can be really helpful in assisting you in selecting PFAS-free products to use in your home. When we think about PFAS, we also have to consider their presence in cleaning products. And so some of the simple advice is to make your own cleaning products using ingredients like vinegar and baking soda. Choosing fragrance-free products will also reduce your exposure to sort of environmental chemicals that we might be concerned about, the endocrine disrupting chemicals. And you can use EPA to help look for safer choices. Environmental Working Group also has a verified mark that they use to indicate that products have no sort of chemicals of concern related in them. Finally, we can think about reducing exposure to PFAS from personal care products. The simplest thing to do is to simply use fewer personal care products every day. You want to read the labels and understand the chemicals that might be present in your cosmetics, in your moisturizers, and the things that you're using to wash yourself. And I do often tell people that if this is a change that you're looking to make, sort of the most bang for your buck is to pay attention to the types of products that have really prolonged contact with your skin. So things that you're using like moisturizer, certain cosmetics, deodorant that are going to be in contact with your skin all day is kind of the first place to start to make those changes to try and move to a PFAS-free product. Versus thinking about the types of things that you're washing off of your body very quickly once they come into contact. Now, of course, if you have PFAS in those wash-off products, they're going to end up in our environment. So, in a voting with your dollars kind of sense, choosing PFAS-free whenever is possible is really the best policy. But this definitely is a way that you can sort of help reduce your exposure from those personal care products. Once again, you want to choose fragrance-free options where possible. Next slide, please, John. All right, and so changing gears a little bit, I wanted to mention to this group and also hopefully get a little bit of feedback from you as important stakeholders in this conversation that we recently developed medical providers fact sheet geared towards clinicians in the state of New Hampshire. This was something that grew out of an earlier stakeholder effort in 2018, where we were hearing from community members in PFAS contaminated communities that they were having difficulties communicating with their clinicians, with their primary care providers, the people who were giving them healthcare about PFAS, and that there was a frequent lack of knowledge and understanding in terms of the kind of basics about what PFAS are and what they might mean in terms of health effects. And so this was a project that my team at Dartmouth worked on with New Hampshire DPHS. We are getting ready to update it, which will have a little bit more of a reflection of the updated ATSDR guidance. We had mentioned the sort of findings from the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine, from the NASEM report in this fact sheet originally, and we have been talking with our partners at DHHS about how to update that now that ATSDR has updated its guidance. We also know there's this sort of anticipated EPA rule that's planned for later this year, possibly very soon, related to the water guidelines for PFAS. And so we're planning to make some updates to this fact sheet. And so the QR code here can be used to access the current fact sheet as it stands. I really would welcome feedback from this group on any thoughts that you might have about what would be useful to include in this, and how best to update it to really make it helpful for folks who are needing to chat with their medical providers about concerns around PFAS exposure. All right, John, I think that's it for me, right? Next slide.
Yep, that's it.
Thank you.
And thank you, Megan. And so our last person is not actually a speaker. She is just here to answer maybe some questions. It is Dr. Winnie Johnchek, who is here from UNH Extension to basically give us, insights to how we might think about trying to find resources or asking questions around agriculture and home produce and growing questions. And some of this is to hear your concerns as well, so she can bring that back to her colleagues. So with that, here is the contact information, and we're going to open up for questions and discussion now. So really quick, I'll start with Rob. Is there anyone with their hand up, or are there any questions in the chat, since we completely forgot about those folks last time and I think went 30 minutes without even recognizing them?
Hello, John. No questions yet.
Oh, okay. Is there anyone? Yeah, so we have one question here in the room. Sure.
biosolids that is allowed to be put into what is considered organic compost. Because biosolids contain most of the heavy metals and PFAS that end up in compost.
This is a great question. I'm going to repeat it for the audience, and I hope I did it. I hope I did it correctly. You're asking if there's a certain amount of biosolids that can be put in compost that's used for household purposes or residential purposes. Is that the application you're thinking of?
Yes, I mean, and largely biosolids from municipal wastewater systems are put into compost that's used broadly in compost applications for soil amendment, for whether it's home gardening or even commercial gardening.
Thanks. So biosolids from, say, municipal wastewater are pretty highly regulated. There are certain ways and places that it can go after it goes from the wastewater facility and is post-processed. And it can be post-processed in a lot of different ways. Some of the research that my group has done based on samples that have been collected from DES is to try to look at the PFAS and places that we post-process these municipal solids. And so there's been some samples collected that were anaerobically digested, for example, or composted, for example, or other lime as an agent that we had to post-process these waste. And then typically the type of waste and the way that it's post-processed determines how it can be used, whether it can be land applied. And generally, that's the primary route for which biosolids go. It's generally land applied in specific agricultural areas that are used for specific use. In some cases, I believe that there may be some products that are coming from municipal sludges that might be going into compost, but it's typically routed to a very different direction. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm saying that better. You want to add to that, John? So there's no limit, basically, especially for the residential side. You want to add to that?
Yeah, so this is where I feel bad we did not bring Anthony Druin from our program because he is our Sultan of Sludge. So his program does oversee a lot of the testing requirements and sort of tracking that we do with the state for biosolids, and they understand that whole economy and life cycle of it. New Hampshire is pretty unique in that early on we added PFAS testing as a requirement for their sludge certification. So ahead of a lot of other states, we actually started tracking that, and that's something that Anthony has all kinds of terrible Excel graphs that he can go through with you because he doesn't know how to make a graph to save his life. But we do track that data along with heavy metals because that's something early on with biosolids that there are certain requirements that they need to meet in order for it to be added to these different uses. So that is something that we are tracking as far as using the sludge certification to understand what the concentrations are of PFAS in our biosolids. And that is also one of the reasons that we know the biosolids in New Hampshire aren't comparable to those older biosolids that were used at certain times in certain places in Maine that really contribute to a lot of that farmland contamination. These were different and they're much lower, but it is also something that when we have a soil standard go through, that soil standard will slowly work its way through and have impacts on things like that biosolids program and what standards and what's acceptable for application and extreme use.
Follow-up to that, based off of your answer, does the state of New Hampshire regulate compost that comes from out of state into New Hampshire? Such as I could go to a local soil place and they receive their compost, their organic compost from places in Maine.
This is a really difficult thing to track. And I was going to add to Dr. Vitale's answer by saying that compost is an area I think that it's difficult to know where things are coming from because oftentimes compost needs even additives to make it work correctly. And so when we were looking at some of the data collected by DES, we found that the compost actually had really different signatures than some of the other products that we were tracking, in part maybe because they add amendments to try to make it work properly. Let's see.
they get in addition to the compost, there's so many products that are in some of the materials that we're composting that we don't understand very well. I use recyclable or compostable bags. We have this situation with some of the compostable products, that can go into this. So I think compost is a really important area for us to try to understand better. And there are a lot of products that are coming in some of the compost facilities here. So we do have stuff coming in from Massachusetts, sometimes from New York, and they're permitted here in New Hampshire. So we do know that that's happening, interstate movement of some of these materials. I'm not sure if that answers your question fully. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just broadly, because there's compost materials that pretty easily move back and forth. I know Anthony would just come screaming into the room from across the state if I did not add this in. Is that New Hampshire, we do have a rule that if your biosolids aren't okay in your own state, we don't accept them here, and we have our own standards. So we're kind of annoying with some of the neighboring states right now, because this is something with PFAS and awareness of biosolids. If you can't apply it in your own state, where can you send it to be managed? And this gets into a really large municipal headache problem that for town leaders, municipal leaders here probably dreaded sort of maybe the impacts of this. But with states like Massachusetts and other ones looking at banning land use of certain biosolids, it's becoming an issue where we don't really take them here. It's going to be a question of where those go. So it's something that we're going to hear more about in the future.
I'm trying to get an understanding of where we currently stand in our thoughts about agriculture. I know you've done a certain amount of screening in hay and tomatoes and apples and strawberries and eggs and deer and whatever. What is the current recommendation to people in Newington about what you've found?
So we, being the state here in New Hampshire, so my environmental health program, we haven't seen all that data yet that the Air Force collected that was sampled in backyards here. And
You want to repeat the question?
oh yeah, let me repeat the question. So the question was, we've been doing sampling for hay, strawberry, eggs, a lot of other backyard produce items here in Newington, and we've been doing work looking at agriculture. So what does this mean? And at this time, we're still waiting to see that data from the Air Force to evaluate it. They are supposed to have their own screening levels that they compare that against. We are waiting for them to evaluate that. Some of this I recognize is also probably hard for the Air Force, because when you're getting into a lot of these backyard items, it's raising questions that they might need input from other agencies on, and they may be trying to figure out this time. So until we see that, it's hard for us to screen it. It's something that when we have that data, that's something that we will evaluate the health program and see where that stands. But we also know that it's possible that over the next year, the goalpost or those screening levels that are used may be changing as well. So
So tonight, when I hear things about HEPA filters to keep the dust out of your house, or some of the recommendations about venison or whatever, those are just generalizations across the whole country that you're making. They're not specific to anything that you know has been happening close to humans. Because it seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between what I've been hearing from the ground and what I'm hearing tonight.
So a lot of recommendations tonight are pretty general, but there is also that challenge of, like with the egg example. So we know that they have tested eggs and that they have detected PFAS in those egg samples. We're still waiting the Air Force to share that data and see where does it land against screening levels. But for anyone that has backyard chickens, if you're raising any birds like that, or if you have a garden, there is the question of what contaminated groundwater may have contributed. But getting back to that example with Amherst, if you are going to any local garden center and buying a bag of certain compost or soil amendment, or using certain fertilizers, that may be adding on to this. And that's not to say that there's no contribution from the water, the irrigation, but we want to try to figure out what's driving PFAS concentrations at a place. Because we don't have a situation where we put treatment on your well and say your garden is totally fine to use, or have someone dig up all the soil in your garden and replace it with soil from somewhere else, only to find out that it's the same concentration of PFAS in any soil that we would get it from. Or if you're using like a compost or some other amendment, that's actually adding more in than even with whatever treatment we might ask for them to do, it'll just keep adding it to that. So really it's more of the thing for folks. We're trying to at least give some awareness that there might be these other ways that PFAS could be coming in. I still strongly recommend push at the RAD meetings, one, to know what that data is, what has been sampled, but also understand that they might be trying to think about these other questions as well about what could be the sources of PFAS in that. Yeah.
I think I care about the sources, but I think the question for people that raise chickens here in Newington are like, should I eat these eggs? You know, it's not like, oh, did the PFAS come from these or Great Bay or wherever the precipitation? It's just like, okay, if there's PFAS in my chicken eggs, is that safe for me to cook every day for my family? Like that, I think that's one of the bigger questions people are trying to grapple with. And I don't know if you have any guidance on that. I don't know, what do we tell people that are like, my eggs exceed screening levels that the Air Force established? What do I do?
Yeah, and I think that's where if we get the data in and we can look at how much it exceeds the screening levels, one of the things we can try to do is at least give some guidance on how much is, right, if you're eating X number of eggs per day, how much is becoming too much problem? How much we recommend people scale back? What gets harder after that is what exactly is the fix for those chickens? And that's the part that we're sort of grappling with is, you know, we could tell you to have an advisory, don't eat this many eggs, but if it turns out that it's actually only an issue in May or June, after they've had a certain number of weeks outside and they've eaten certain things, but then they're okay the rest of the year, that's something we're still trying to understand is what are all these other factors that we want to understand better if we're going to actually make recommendations about eat, do not eat. And even for us as an agency, imagine the Air Force being arranged this, is with backyard eggs, we don't provide this kind of guidance for lead, which we know chickens can pick up. And if you have an older home, there's probably lead in your soil. We have a lead screening program for soils. UH Extension does lead and heavy metal testing. It's sort of a challenging area for us because we're still trying to understand, is it even okay if people have been eating eggs in the first place? So, but to get it though, as data comes in, once you know that we do have a program state that you can contact to go over your results, you have those. It just, depending on Air Force disclosures, we don't immediately get those. Yeah.
You know if there's PFAS in chicken feed?
There have been some studies that have looked at that, where depending on what kind of feed you give chickens, so for example, if it's fish meal, if you go back and look at our last week video, we know that fish contain PFAS. So a lot of the fish meal that's given to a lot of animals is a source of PFAS into them. There used to be old rodent studies that they used to do for PFAS toxicity, and they realized some of the rodent chow had PFAS already. But even like the food bags, other things like that could be a source. And the wisdom that I heard from a faculty member at UNH is there's a difference between what you feed your chickens and what they eat. Yeah.
We know, based on what you told us, that the chemicals accumulate in eggs. What other products would they, do you see them, you know, maybe tomatoes aren't too bad, but such and such is worse, or certain variations? The other, thinking about apples and fruit bearing trees. And I'm also wondering about local honey.
Loaded questions. I'm going to try to repeat the entire question. So what you were asking about So we talked about eggs, we talked about exposure from eggs, uptake in eggs, but what else would we be suspicious of?
Right, because you said some plants don't really take it so much, but others might. So I'm just trying to, which ones are more susceptible and which ones are kind of safer?
So some of that, we're still, do you want to take the first step of that?
That makes sense.
Absolutely. I think some of the work that's come from Maine and other related studies is showing that when you have cattle, for example, that are eating a lot of vegetation material haze that have PFAS in them, and then they're super concentrating those in their milk. The milk is where the PFAS is a problem. And so, that's a problem because they're eating so much of that biomass, and then they use that to generate that milk. And so it's the place where they're seeing that super concentrate. So, that's one example of where this is happening at a larger scale. You want to take the next step?
Yeah, so it depends a lot on which of the PFAS in the family you're talking about. So some of the shorter ones, so the smaller squiggly line, when we draw them out, those tend to accumulate more in the plants. A lot of different kinds of plants, we sort of see that. The longer ones that are more of an issue for milk and for eggs and for animal products don't seem to accumulate as much in plants. So there's sort of a split in that question of which half of the family or parts of the family are we talking about for PFAS.
We have to do with water solubility versus fat solubility and those different.
It has something to do with, yeah, it has something to do with their water solubility, fat solubility, and the terrible fact that PFAS sort of straddle the line of that a lot.
I'm very disturbed about the fact that if you're putting stuff in your soil that you think is organic, it's got full of PFAS that we won't know that nobody's putting that label on, they're labeling it organic. And so we're saying, oh, I'd rather pay a little more and get the organic than get this kind because it probably has more PFAS. And that's in fact wrong. That's very disturbing. So, but have you done studies to look to see, do organic eggs in fact have less PFAS than non-organic eggs or organic apples?
So really quick, we're going to see Dr. Romano. So Dr. Romano, the question was, has anyone done any work looking at organic and non-organic labeling of food and whether that makes a difference on PFAS presence and concentrations?
I am not aware of any research at this time that has specifically looked at that kind of organic, not organic designation for thinking about PFAS concentrations in either eggs or in produce. I think the eggs are something that we're just sort of starting to think about in the sort of epidemiologic realm in terms of thinking about types of food groups where we may be seeing more PFAS. So the short answer is I have not seen those studies published yet. I agree with you that they would be incredibly important and helpful to kind of guide consumers.
Yeah.
This question for Dr. Romano. Is there a difference between prepackaged microwave popcorn, or are you seeing PFAS in all popcorn that's been microwaved?
Did you get that again?
I did.
Okay.
That's a great question. So the problem with the microwave popcorn is that the PFAS coating is often actually in the bag that's used to microwave the popcorn. The popcorn itself there's oil in the bag, it gets quite greasy. So the PFAS are used again for those kind of oil and grease resistant properties so that the paper bag doesn't then kind of disintegrate in the microwave. It's a little bit tricky because not all microwave popcorn is going to have PFAS in it, but again, it's one of these things that is not clearly labeled. So I would say avoid microwave popcorn full stop. If you want, and this is actually one of the most consistent things that we've seen in epidemiologic studies where we sort of look at what people are eating and look at what their blood levels of PFAS are. Microwave popcorn is one of the things that has kind of come out again and again. So I would say just say no to microwave popcorn. We don't use it in my home. So I don't think I would be comfortable making any kind of narrower distinctions about some versus others being okay or not.
Yeah.
Just sort of along that same vein. So I stopped using microwave popcorn a long time ago, but I did buy a silicone microwave cover. What about silicone? I mean, I look at the silicone and I'm always like, because you're not, you don't want to use plastic, but what about silicone? I mean, is silicone the same as plastic or is that better?
No, Megan, do you want to take a stab at that? Did you hear that one?
I can. The question was, I think, about silicone as a sort of cookware, and specifically in the microwave for popcorn making. So based on what we know about silicone right now, there's not a reason to be concerned about PFAS specifically. The silicone can, to some degree, break down, and so you do want to probably think about replacing it a little bit more frequently than you would with something like, one of the kind of glass poppers that you can put into the microwave to pop your popcorn. No major concerns about silicone, but I think we're still kind of understanding more and more about it because it is one of the sort of newer materials that we've seen in the cookware scene.
Yeah, Andrew.
I had some questions about the screening levels. You had a chart of them.
Yeah.
Some of them had pretty big ranges on them, and I was curious if you could speak to that. Like for eggs for PFOS, it was 0.8 to 4.2. That seems like really like a big range. So can you tell me why there's a range of the screening level? And
so it's a range of like frequency, how many eggs someone's consuming, but also person's age. So right, the lower end of that is if you have a small child consuming an egg a day versus the higher end of that being an adult who's only consuming an egg a day. That's one of the things like with a screening level is if it's above that, we also want to go and understand how frequently is someone actually consuming those eggs. Right. So when I make an omelet, I make a 3-egg omelet, but I don't have a 3-egg omelet every day. And that's one of the things that we want to go in and try to understand what's actually going on with that risk there. So that's where the range on those comes in. It's just getting into the specifics of the scenario of what it is. The bigger uncertainty, especially with chickens, is when basically any vertebrate gets PFAS into their body, they typically store pretty high amounts of it in their blood, their liver, kidneys, certain organs. In egg-laying animals, they have a real talent for converting liver protein into egg yolk precursor. And they can mobilize PFAS along with that. So when you see concentrations of PFAS in a chicken egg, unless you have really constant sources in their water, their diet, and everything else, that's actually probably a really dynamic number. And that's even one of the things like with the egg testing with the NLPs that we sort of had a question about is how frequently was this done? Because if you catch a bird at their peak, right, that egg is taking a large amount of PFAS out with it. And that's where some of the other groups that have done research on eggs and chickens and PFAS, they've seen where when they're outside and they have access just to the native dirt or the ecosystem, the concentrations go up. But then when they have overwinter or when they're in a more restrictive setting, they don't have access just to open forage, those levels come down quickly. And that's one of the things that can also feed into the range on that is, are we talking about birds that right, are in a scenario where they have constant access to whatever might be that PFAS source, or are they only hitting these higher levels for a couple days out of the year? And that's just something we still don't understand very well.
Where is that FDA data? You said they have egg data where they've looked at like commercial farms and stuff like that.
Yes.
Is that publicly? Because we asked for that on the wrap of the Air Force, and I think they had said they hadn't looked, they weren't aware, or they hadn't looked into that, because we were like, what would be in a normal chicken egg, you know, for PFAS versus.
So I will start and see if Dr. Romano's chime in after this. So the FDA has done grocery store studies. I have to be careful not to say market basket, because for the researchers, they call it lowercase m, lowercase b market basket studies, but they don't understand that all of us in New England actually have market baskets, and we're not talking about market basket. But there have been market basket studies that they've done where they've collected food samples from various vendors across the country, and the FDA does the sampling to look at what's represented in grocery store chains in our large food production systems. They are not focusing on local small farms or what people are producing in their backyard. That data is available if you go down a rabbit hole on the FDA's website. If you just Google FDA PFAS, they have a page that comes up, and then they have really obscure links somewhere down there that says, and check out our sampling data ad. And it's just a weird hyperlink. But they do have that information there. And that's where when we look at the grocery store eggs, which are mostly coming from the really sad chickens and giant factory facility, we don't see very high or noticeable detectable levels. But when we look in peer reviewed literature and we see animals that are allowed to really forage outside, and especially if they're near industrial facilities in certain parts of China that are actually manufacturing PFOA and PFOS still, then we see the levels come back up. Yeah. So really quick, Megan, did you have anything you want to add into that? Because I know you're more into the food literature than I am at times, depending on the menu item.
No, I think that was pretty solid. I will just add there are some studies out of Denmark looking at eggs too. I'm not quite sure how relevant they are to our context here in New England, but that's the only other kind of egg data that I'm aware of outside of that FDA data that you mentioned, John.
And then we had two questions over here.
I was just going to say, I think from being on the Air Force's grants, the sample size was a grand total of 6 eggs in June, so it's really limited. I should say it could change over the year. But last week you mentioned that the limiting factor in looking into a lot of this was funding.
Yeah.
Having technicians and the lab in Canada shut down, so there's to do tissue samples. So I assume that's still the case here. So, I mean, can you foresee anything being done to like the question that we have is, okay, so we found, I believe, barely above screening levels in the eggs that they did find. So it wasn't, there's somewhat above, but our screening level used. But can you foresee any time in the next few years having access to do a broader study across the state or in the region to find out if it's anomalous in this area or it's just kind of the way it's made?
Can I just make a comment before I pass it over about the testing piece of it?
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to find a lab that can do these kinds of samples. In fact, in conversations with the USGS, I know that eggs are very difficult for them to handle because of their consistency and their chemistry. And I think they also carry a lot of variability, you know, and so you're right, you need to analyze a lot of them to really feel confident about what you're seeing. And similarly, analyzing vegetation is very difficult. There are not a lot of labs that are doing that. It requires grinding of the sample and getting it into a solution that they can then extract, you know, the PFAS from. And the EPA took several years to come up with methods for very clean water. And so a lot of these are non-standard methods and they're really challenging. So anytime we think about a different media, whether it's an egg or a different part of the chicken or, you know, something else we're looking at, it requires some adaptation and there's a lot of, you know, challenges there. So I just wanted to mention that because we are finding it challenging to find labs that are capable of adapting to some of these different types of media. Were you gonna pass it over about funding?
Yeah, I was gonna say, if Wendy wanted to say a word or two just about in general how like food safety testing works, because I know from like our own program, there's the concern for PFAS, but even a lot of the other questions just about contaminants in backyard items, so heavy metals and things. Oftentimes, state agencies heavily turn to our extension partners to try to understand what resources that they have, what approaches they've done, because oftentimes they have a better framework in place of how to work with large scale, small scale growers, and really what goes into logistics of trying to get testing programs. So I don't know if you want to say anything else to that, or if I just match with it somehow.
Can you also explain what the extension is?
Yeah, so Wendy Jenichek again with, so dual appointment with UNH, Department of Agriculture, Nutrition and Food Systems, and with Cooperative Extension. So I'm actually on the Food and Agriculture team in Cooperative Extension, which we have production specialists around in the counties around the state who work with agriculture producers on a whole variety of production issues. Myself, I'm a food safety state specialist. So to speak to the item in terms of labs, so UNH Cooperative Extension, we do have some lab capacity where we do soil testing. We do not do PFAS testing in relation to soils. So that is something that we are actually looking at in terms of just re-looking at all of our, we have a new soil health state specialist who's also interested in this work as well. We're actually looking at all the different areas of what we are doing soil testing on. Jonathan, I don't know if you wanted me to speak beyond that in just terms of extension is, I mean, that's partly why I'm here, to see what are the interests, we typically work with agriculture producers, but we do work with folks, for example, our soil health testing is open to residents around the state. So that is something, please do use if you have questions about that. And, we aren't doing PFAS, we are doing other chemical contaminants, you can do arsenic, et cetera, lead, in addition to sort of some of the fertility samples. So I think that's it in terms of just Jonathan, do you know, I was just curious, are you familiar to what extent the FDA is actually putting any resources into actually some of the PFAS sampling and some of their products? Because I mean, generally speaking, those labs do have some capacity.
So the FDA labs are focused heavily right now on trying to develop methods. So as Dr. Mauser mentioned, it is a nightmare to try to analyze an egg, a strawberry, and milk using the same instrument. Just drives the chemists crazy. But FDA is working on developing better methods around that. So that has been a big focus on their part. Their labs can help to transfer some of that knowledge and ability. But again, it runs just into the issue of the cost of doing analysis can be very prohibitive. And that's one of the things that has really stalled some states on being able to look into this more. Maine has a huge impact to their agricultural systems. They are able to put a lot of funding towards that. They have some instruments that are going into it. But even then, they're still contracting to outside labs. The state's own food safety lab does not have an instrument for analyzing PFAS. Buying one of those is very expensive, maybe hundreds of thousands, and that's before maintenance and hiring a technician to operate it, and then all the supplies to do those analysis. I know for one of the contract labs that we get a nice discount for because we're the state and we buy things in bulk, it's pushing about $500 a sample if we wanted to do egg analysis. So 500 times 6, that's how much we would have paid for. And then also there's still the shipping and paying for them to make a nice Excel file out of it. But that is one of the challenges here. And that's one of the things that's made it hard for some of the programs. So like with mercury and fish tissue testing, that's easy. We get a mercury analyzer, someone brings us a fish. People aren't bringing us fish anymore. So if you go out fishing, please bring us fish. We have instrumentation and have the ability to do that. With PFAS, we just don't have it. So it's hard for us to get the data. And that's where if resources wasn't an issue and we had the instrumentation, we just come out and sample the eggs ourselves and see what's going on. We wouldn't wait for the Air Force. But they've done sampling, they have the data. By the time we go out, collect things, there's also an issue right now, just logistics for the private labs, that people are ending up on wait lists for weird samples like eggs, meat, milk, things like that, that can last a couple of months. When I did that vegetable study, it took us 8 months to get the results back from the lab, because all the other states and the federal government and everyone is swamping the labs right now with weird samples that they want to analyze for PFAS. Go right back here and we'll come back to you.
Soil for like arsenic and lead. Has any of that been tested with PFAS? Like consistent leak?
Yeah, so the question is, and I'll just summarize, is there an industry and technology for cleaning soil of PFAS? It's in development. There are a lot of groups that are trying to come up with technologies. Some of them are big scale, some of them are little scale. The thing for a lot of the states right now is just trying to understand which of these can actually get up to scale to deal with the amount of solids that we're looking at and the amount of soils. The bigger priority right now is dealing with either biosolids or leachate from landfills. So that's stuff that comes out of landfills, highly concentrated. And actually the top of the queue right now is to deal with all the firefighting foam that we have in barrels all over the place. I don't know if you want to add anything to.
There are some really promising technologies for cleaning PFAS out of liquids like landfill leachate and groundwater by making it foam and concentrated. But it's really difficult with soils. And actually, you know, the more organics those soils have, the more challenging to see those out. We want to save them. So.
This question is for Megan. She talked about that fact sheet for medical providers and how that would be updated based on ATSDR's recent guidance. I was just wondering if there's a timeline on when that would be done, and then also the ATSDR guidance and the NASEM guidance don't quite align. And I'm just wondering how your fact sheet would reconcile that, and particularly the NASEM guidance says that people in highly impacted communities should be blood tested, where the ATSDR guidance doesn't quite go that far and just says they can be and lists benefits and limitations. So just curious about that.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So there's not a strict timeline other than we're starting to meet about it in the next couple of weeks to decide on the updates that we'll be doing. We had just kind of built into our original protocol for the fact sheet that when the ATSDR guidance was released, we would review it and plan to make updates to the fact sheet accordingly. I will say I share your concerns about the kind of disconnect between ATSDR and the NASEM findings, and it is something that I really would welcome community feedback about. There are several different voices involved in the group that is working on updating the fact sheet, and I think some people lean more heavily towards the ATSDR guidance and others towards the NASEM guidance. So I'm not quite sure where we're going to land in terms of the update, but I very strongly want to hear from community members and try to get those perspectives to be well reflected in whatever update we do. So I think I hear in the question that you yourself might lean a little bit towards the NASEM guidance, but I would say, you know, my contact information is here, and I would love to hear from folks, even if not tonight, while we're kind of on the line together here, about what your thoughts are in terms of the ATSDR versus the NASEM guidance and what you wish that your physicians knew.
I could just ask a follow-up to that too. Megan, being at Dartmouth Medical School, I'm just curious if there's any initiatives to incorporate information about PFAS exposure in medical training, because that's something that, you know, communities we've learned that our physicians don't know a lot about PFAS because they don't get a lot of training in environmental exposures. And I'm just curious if you know, if you're part of creating this fact sheet, is there any initiatives to incorporate some of this into the curriculum? So doctors coming out of medical school, maybe we can't get everyone who's already out, but we can start educating people as they're being trained. So it's not a foreign concept to them when people come to them with concerns about being exposed to PFAS.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've heard this sort of startling statistic that most medical students get about 8 hours of instruction in environmental health during their medical training. And that's actually probably somewhat out of date, and I would anticipate that it's probably a little bit less that's in the standard medical curriculum for most schools. So I will say we're in the early stages of thinking about this. There's a group at the Dartmouth Institute, which is affiliated with Dartmouth College as well, not officially part of the medical school, but a lot of the great public health work that comes out of Dartmouth is housed there. And they have been doing some work on surveying medical students and different medical schools just to understand how much environmental content is or is not currently in the med school curriculum. It is very difficult to get the medical school curriculum itself changed because of the process to go through the step 1 exams and the boards. Most medical schools have their curriculums very much locked down. What we've been trying to target is continuing medical education. And so I've been involved in a number of efforts to engage in creating, outreach opportunities and training that would count for continuing medical education so that when people are trying to keep up their CMA credits to keep their licenses, this would be additional training that they would get. We've been working with a group of folks who are really based in primary care to try and understand if there are additional ways that we could try and get this into residency and fellowship training. So that additional kind of medical training that happens after the 4 years of formal medical school. And it seems to me like that might be a place where we get a little bit more traction. And I've also been involved in a few efforts through the Cancer Center, through Dartmouth Cancer Center, geared at trying to create some like mixed level interventions, as we call them, where we would be working on educating both patients and clinicians about PFAS and trying to help people kind of get connected to knowledgeable physicians and receive the medical care that they need related to the PFAS. So I want to acknowledge that those are all kind of baby steps, but we are trying, and there are definitely a lot of good folks that are working on that and trying to shift the needle a little bit so that we do get to our clinicians earlier and they are at least aware of environmental health concerns broadly when they're getting into practice.
With individual chickens that over time, the amount of PFAS in their eggs can vary depending on certain conditions. So certain months they might have more or less, or et cetera. Do we know if the PFAS also goes into into the flesh or different other parts of the chicken? And that's one question. The other question is, if a human has measured certain levels of PFAS in their blood, would we expect, based on what we might understand from a chicken, that human who was exposed 5 years ago or some period of time ago might not have it in their system anymore, or would it accumulate and stay somewhere?
So I will start this and then I'll let Megan pick up when I trail off somewhere. So I'll try to make sure that's right. So your first half of your question was, we know there's variation in chickens. We know there's probably variation in how much PFAS there is over time. Is it just the egg? Is it the chicken? Is it the chicken and the egg? And the answer to that, it's probably every different part of the chicken, but at different amounts.
So it might vary more in the egg, but have less somewhere in the body, but
Yeah, so
Be
it's,
more stable.
yeah, we expect a little bit more stability in what's in the bird, but again, they're putting a lot of the PFAS into the eggs. It's taking a lot of the PFAS out of the bird. And we probably expect to see the most PFAS in like their blood, their liver, their kidneys. Usually when we've been looking across animals and we look across their different organs and tissue types, the muscle has low concentrations. So if we even go back to like the deer sampling that was done out here, gosh, going back to 2019, 2020, earlier than that, fishing made my money somewhere. Right when they looked there, it was non-detected in the muscle for the most part. And where we actually did see trace amounts was in the liver, because in most animals we see higher proportions of liver tissue types. Humans are not chickens. We have some differences, but we do see that there is some compartmentalization where if you look, you're going to see PFAS in all the tissues. Qualitatively, yes, you see PFAS sort of everywhere, but in very different amounts and very different proportions. Megan, do you want to follow up anything?
I think I would just follow up that. So some of the other work that I do is looking at PFAS in breast milk, and some of what we're learning about that is that the sort of the protein content matters. And so I think that in terms of, you know, sort of the amount of PFAS that are moving into the egg versus accumulating in the chicken is going to be influenced by a lot of factors, like the chicken's diet and what their sort of protein intake is, as well as how much you know, protein is going into the egg. So I agree with everything John said, and I think it's probably incredibly complex and likely to be variable across different scenarios where you might have chickens laying eggs.
The human had concentration of 100 units when they measured their blood in 2019. You know, we expect that to be a transient number, and in that human, and have less of it over time, I imagine.
It depends if you've been able to reduce the exposure. Because if you, so for example, if you have 100 units and your primary source, the large source of your exposure was contaminated drinking water, and you have not transitioned off of said drinking water, we expect that to stay pretty steady. There might be a slight dip from all the other sources for certain PFAS, because some of them have phased out of commerce, so some of them we've seen go down as other ones have gone up, right? Because they're replacing PFAS with PFAS. But the big thing is about exposure reduction. Where you can reduce exposure, the more you expect to see that decline over time. It's going to be gradual based on a lot of things, based on your sex, based on your age, a whole bunch of other swirly factors that we're still learning about. But again, if you have a major source of exposure that's still going on, and you're not addressing it, but we don't expect love to go down. And that's, you know, kind of getting back to the chicken egg example of if we find that the source of PFAS to chickens and contaminated eggs isn't the water, it's the soil. Well, fixing the water is not going to fix what's going on with the chickens. Now, in this case, it's your home well, it's your drinking water. We want you to fix that. Please fix it.
So if that gets fixed, we expect over time the level in the human to reduce.
Yes.
And do we know, did it take 5 years, 10 years, whatever?
It depends on which PFAS. It depends on which PFAS you're talking about. So the ones that we primarily regulate, the longer chains have the longer swigglies. Those tend to be, they have a half-life, which is on an order of years to decades. So the half-life being how long it takes you to go from 100 units to 50 units, 50 units to 25 units, 25 units to 12 and a half units. That's a half-life.
If it accumulates, let's say in the liver or wherever, do we expect to see higher rates of liver disease or whatever disease, depending on where we think it accumulates in the body? And is there any link there to any data?
Megan, are you catching this?
I think so. So there certainly is some evidence of both renal and hepatic, so renal, kidney and liver effects, adverse consequences for exposure. I don't know that I would say that it's specifically because of the accumulation. I think the biological underpinnings are a little bit more complicated than that, because we do see health effects of PFAS sort of all over the body, influencing many aspects of the endocrine system. And so it's not simply related to where it's accumulating, but kidney and liver adverse health effects are things that we expect with high levels of PFAS exposure.
Thank you. Other questions, Andrew?
I just want to put kind of a summary on this, and I want to understand, for people living in Newington who have participated in these produce studies and the egg studies and have possibly well data and soil data, again, how do they reconcile all of this? Like, how do they make choices on behalf of their family if they, decide if they should eat something or not eat something, or how do we, it sounds like there's a lot of unknowns. There's screening levels, there's no regulations. We don't know what's different from like a grocery store chicken egg versus a Newington chicken egg, a small sample that's been collected. So what can we tell the community about what they can do with the food in their backyard? Like, is it safe? Is it not? What should they think about?
So I think one of the first things to do is, one, there is going to be some data coming out, and we can start getting some initial thoughts there, right? And that's the screening approach. Is okay, what do we need to investigate specifically here? I think one of the other things that I'm hoping is to take away from this, and I'm not doing a good job on it, I'm sorry, but it is complicated trying to figure out how to reduce PFAS exposure from all these different sources. But we developed a really collaborative group of people that if somebody wants to talk through what's going on in their specific situation, we can help them think through that, right? If someone, and I do this all the time as part of my role, where I'm writing a bunch of fancy technical reports, doing all kinds of nerdy stuff, and then I have a 2-hour call with someone from Londonderry to talk through their well results, and then they start telling me about their gardening habits, and then we're moving on to other things that are potentially sources of PFAS to them. I realize that this is a lot of information for people to take in, and I'm hoping that it's more or less just a guide of if you start getting results and you're not entirely sure, or if figuring out labeling is a nightmare, which thing is safe, which thing isn't, we hope to at least be there that folks can call us. And if it's a matter of talking to every single person that we has a result to figure out, okay, what's going on in your current situation, what are you doing with your chickens? Who can we talk to at UNH that specifically understands what else we might be terrified about, because chickens get into all kinds of stuff. Trying to identify that. And if there's potential for resources to do studies around that, we can try to find those. That can be tricky, but there are some steps in these other resources that we point to that most of us know because we've had to read 100 times, and we can probably help someone with a quick call figure out, like, oh yeah, you're getting compost or some mixture of something that probably actually is biosolids in it. So if you're growing vegetables and you are specifically concerned about that, then that would be the place that you can act on. Because not everyone, I've talked with plenty of people that don't understand, when they go to the garden stand, they buy that bag of the really good garden compost, and like some of that's biosolids material, and some of it has food compost material in it that could also be a source of PFAS. And I guess that's the thing that I hope folks could think of doing, is instead of trying to rack their brains and try to make all decisions, right, give us a call and let us help start at least framing that and figure out what are the next questions they could be asking.
Yes, I would say, can you not say to us, okay, here's the kind of compost you should use, and here's the kind you should not use. Like you say, don't use, the nonstick pans, or don't use the bags that have the PFAS in them, for your popcorn. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we need. Or can you also say to us, don't buy produce that's been grown in Newington. Go to, how far away do we have to go to buy produce that's not contaminated? I mean, that's the kind of information we need. What are we doing right here in Newington that either we should be doing or we shouldn't be?
Well, and I think that right there gets me saying that having some better guidance or at least information on how to better shop for compost like that. If it's a matter of making it back and me writing, publishing this link into this, and our person for our biosolids program, and also Sarah, who's over here in the corner, who's one of our community outreach people, and she's hoping I wouldn't call her out tonight. If that's the kind of tool that would be helpful, hearing that right now is helpful for us to figure out that that's something we can start trying to work on. As far as recommending don't buy anything from Newington, like we were saying before, we don't get quite to that point because we're still trying to understand what uptake looks like. And there's a chance the soils and stuff that's being grown here may actually be very similar to just about anywhere else in the state. And we're still trying to understand what that looks like. So that's something to be determined. But if there's things of helping people make those better decisions with buying compost or understanding where people are making some of these other day-to-day decisions at a local level that we can develop fact sheets for, guidance, TikTok. I don't know what the best media is anymore. But that's stuff that we can try to do because we do have a lot of expertise in that area. And I realize some of these national resources that we point to are made for a national audience and they're not made for New Hampshire. So. Any other questions in the room? Any questions online, Rob?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, we're 5 minutes over, so sorry for keeping everyone. But thank you. I'm going to work on getting everything put online, and I know I'm a little late in the last video, and that's because I tried to fill in some of the gaps of the questions that were asked and it wasn't caught on audio. And then I know we're going to have a fun editing exercise with the first part of this meeting, losing the call and joining back in. So thank you all for coming out tonight. And again, if you have any questions, our contact information is up there. Please reach out to us.
And where are we going to be able to find this? I mean,
we will put it on the New Hampshire DES, our YouTube page, and then Martha has already generously volunteered to have that linked to the town website. And that you can just share that all you like. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.